Hello, class, and welcome to week 14 of the Philosophy of God here at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. This is, of course, John Studi, your professor, and we are on part 2 of week 14, where we are now addressing the problem of evil. We've already covered the question of God's divine providence, and now we need to see how it is the case that we can reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of a good, all-powerful, all-knowing God, for which we've already argued in previous course sections. Now, I know we've already addressed this to some extent in some of the previous lectures, but we need to make sure that we can address the problem of evil effectively. Because the problem of evil is the toughest and most effective argument against the existence of God. And so, if we're going to understand our subject matter well, which is the philosophy of God, then we would be completely amiss if we don't at least have a good general outline of the strongest argument against the existence of God, as well as a few replies to it, and in particular, a genuine Thomistic approach, which looks at the problem of evil from the classical theist position, which renders the problem of evil dead on arrival. We'll see why that's the case in a little bit here. But to begin with, the problem of evil, at least the first argument here, first version of it, has been repeated throughout the centuries, all the way from Epicurus to Hume to J.L. Mackie in the late 20th century, and obviously to our own time. And according to this, and this argument goes something like this. So, according to classical theists, God is omnipotent, so he's all powerful, he's omniscient, he knows everything, and God is omnibenevolent. And if it's true, then God would have the power to stop evil. What could prevent him from carrying out his will? And if he wills only good things, then he could always make it so that only good things happen, right? Or God would know how to stop evil, if it's true that he's omniscient, because what could take him by surprise? How he would know how to go about stopping all the different evils and solving all the various problems that would come about if he eliminated certain causal factors. And furthermore, if God was all good, then he would want to stop evil, because it's completely contrary to his nature for there to be evil in the world. So, if all those divine attributes are true, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, and what we would find then is, well, there would be no evil in the world. But, in case you haven't noticed, there is evil in the world. And so, either God is not all powerful, not all knowing, he's not all good, or simply, he doesn't exist. Clearly, this gives us a very powerful argument against God's existence, and it's one that swayed many people. In fact, although from my personal experience, I would say that the problem of evil is one that justifies the leap to atheism, but I think most people are more swayed by arguments like God is unnecessary, which are more or less the only other arguments that atheists typically present, is that God's not actually necessary, and so he's not a quote-unquote hypothesis that we need to postulate. But the argument of evil, on the other hand, is the one that convinces people, because it actually attempts to prove that God does not exist. Now, there's a second argument, or a second version of the problem of evil that people often use. And it goes simply like this. If God is provident, then he is the knowing cause of all things. And if God is the knowing cause of all things, then he is the cause of evil, because God knows that there's evil in the world. But if God is the cause of evil, then God is not good. And this actually makes quite a bit of sense. If you think about it for a moment, remember that principle that we talked about earlier in the course, that, it's a Gare Secretaire essay. So action follows upon being. And so if God is all good, then it must be the case that he can't do evil things. And conversely, since he does do evil things as the cause of the evil in the world, then it follows that God is at the very least not good, if not evil. How do we respond to this? Well, there's a few different ways. In response to the first problem of evil, the first argument from evil, we could say that since God is an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being, then he would not allow evil, unless he could bring about a greater good as a result of the evil. And since we've already proved that God exists, and that he is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, as we talked about in the various different lectures throughout the course, then it follows that since there's evil in the world, but we also know that God's all good, all knowing, all powerful for independent reasons, then God must allow evil, but only for the sake of a greater good. Now, Aquinas actually says that this shows or demonstrates the omnipotence of God, in that through allowing certain evils, he brings about a greater good than what would have been the case if those evils had not taken place. And now this is somewhat akin to when I watch my son struggle with some task, like writing or reading or coloring. I don't want him to fail, and I don't want him to feel bad about not doing well or making a mistake. However, I know that because failure is a reality of life and that those with the greatest tolerance to failure tend to be the most successful, then I want him to learn how to fail well and to keep on trying with a new vigor and a new approach to the way that he's going about whatever task he's trying to learn or accomplish. Now, if you can mess up badly, even horribly, but then pick yourself up and stop and reflect on the reality that you've tried, you've done your best, and it wasn't quite enough. But here's something I learned, and here's something I can incorporate next time I attempt to do this particular task or pursue this particular goal. Then you've added something to yourself. You've grown. And next time, you'll do it differently. Or if you approach another situation, you'll have some of that experience in your back pocket to pull out in order to be more successful in something that's related, or even something that's completely unrelated because you develop certain skills by reflecting on some of the failures of your past. For instance, I can burn out when I'm doing my martial arts training. In fact, I started doing that today. I was doing skip knees, and in between the skip knees, we were doing these rounds of combination of punches and knee strikes, and all in the heavy bag. And I was going really hard. And the thing is, I paused for a second, and I knew I just wanted to take one breath. But then my coach saw me right away. We were doing this via distance, so we were through Zoom, so everybody was, there was enough social distancing taking place that we weren't going to get sick. And he saw me and he said, "John, keep going." So I kept going, and I realized there, I'm like, oh, I could have kept going, but I chose to stop. So I pushed on harder and harder. And now there was a bit of quote unquote failure there, but then I can take that and apply it to something else in my life, like redoing a lecture or responding to a question or from a student or from a skeptic that seems like it might be a little bit beyond my ability. Or I can take that same failure and that same reflection on that time where I didn't want to push myself a little bit harder to be a better dad, to be a better husband in some way, shape, or form. And now, when it comes to these different failures, if we can pick ourselves up again and try again and do it a little bit differently with more reflection, then we're setting ourselves up for a dramatic increase, not only in the quality of our work, but also in the quality of our lives. And I want that for my son. And in fact, my goal is to make him better than me. I want him to have that tough-mindedness that's required for a long and successful life. Now, similarly, God, in his infinite goodness and knowledge, allows for certain evils in the world for the sake of a greater good. Now, even if we are unaware of what that good might be, the mere possibility that God has a good, which could, in principle, justify, that is where we get the word theodicy from, which is to say to justify or to vindicate God, then the evils that we experience, even some of the greatest evils, have some sort of morally justifiable end or reason for God allowing them to be. And so the problem of evil is not a knockdown logical argument anyway. It doesn't prove what it sets out to prove. And at best, it's a probabilistic argument or an emotional argument from evil. And just to use another analogy for my son, when we were sleep training him, when he was about 1 year, he was a little less than 1 year old, he could not understand why it was the case that Daddy's not snuggling him in the rocking chair snuggling him in the rocking chair all night, or holding him all night in bed. He doesn't get it. He screamed up to the heavens and shouted, "Why? Why? If there's a good dad, does he allow me to sleep in my crib on my own?" It was something that's completely beyond him. But obviously, he needed to grow in independence. And, well, to be honest, more of it, too, was my wife and I needed to sleep. Without sleep, you really start falling apart. You got to get good sleep. And so I had a greater end in mind than what my son at that age could ever understand. In fact, to some extent now it's the same way. When I allow him to fail, or when I push him on after he's not done a good job with like writing or whatever it might be, I push him on to try one more time and to make it just a teeny tiny bit better. He doesn't always understand that because he's 4 years old. His ability to think ahead is about 5 minutes, if that. So in the same way, God has a greater good in mind and a greater end that he intends to bring about in his governance of the world than what we would be able to comprehend on our own. What are some of these goods that God could bring about by allowing evil? Now, a few easy examples of this would be goods like mercy. You couldn't be merciful to somebody if they weren't owing you in some way. You couldn't be courageous if you were never in danger of losing your life or losing some good. You couldn't you couldn't sacrifice yourself to someone else or for some greater cause if there wasn't the possibility of you losing a major good like your life or your bodily integrity. You could never forgive somebody if they never wronged you. You could never have compassion with somebody if they weren't suffering. The word compassion itself means to suffer with. All these things would not be available in a world without at least some evils. Now, this is why even prominent atheists such as J.L. Mackie admit that the problem of evil does not have the force that the atheist often intends it to have, which is to show that it is logically or metaphysically impossible for God to exist because of the, or at least a good God, of the good God of classical theism, for a good God of classical theism to exist, given the fact that there's evil in the world. Now, some atheists have taken this cue and said, well, we can respond to this. Now, William Rowe offers what he calls the evidential problem of evil, which says that we look at the evidence of the world, and even though it's not logically impossible for God to exist, then what we can still say is that there's too much evil. And so it's probable that God doesn't exist, and this is how he argues for it. So the God of classical theism could, in theory, prevent at least some suffering without losing the greater good or without bringing about an even worse evil. Now, some of the evils in our world are ones that could have been prevented without losing sight of the greater good or bringing about a worse evil. So therefore, it's impossible. Therefore it's improbable that the God of classical theism exists. Now, what kind of evils does William Rowe have in mind here? Well, let's take the Bambi example. Now, imagine a raging storm which results in a bolt of lightning striking a dead tree, which sets it aflame and causes it to fall down on a fawn. Bambi, of course, because what else are you going to name a fawn? Maybe Fonzie. Hey, the Fonz. Sorry, that might be a reference way too old for you guys. It's too old for me, but somehow I still know it. Grew up on like 50s TV. It was great. Anyway, the fawn is now pinned to the ground, but doesn't kill it. Now, the lightning caused the tree to ignite, and the wood burns just enough to cause the fawn to be partially immolated, but not consumed by the fire, and not completely destroyed. Rather, he's like Darth Vader on the shores of the river of lava on Mustafar, burnt but still alive, undergoing unspeakable and terrible anguish, unable to move or tend to its wounds. And unlike Darth Vader, he doesn't have the Force, so he can't lift the tree off of himself. He's pinned to the ground. The fawn lives for several more days until death finally relieves the searing, agonizing pain. Now, even if humans, rational creatures, could gain some virtue or insight or some good in light of this sort of immense suffering, the immense suffering of their own death, the painful death, or the death of a child, which would be, in my opinion, worse than their own death, there doesn't seem to be any possible way to balance the scales, so to speak, for the fawn or for its parents. And so, again, therefore, it doesn't seem like the God of classical theism exists. Where's the reason, where's the good for this sort of unspeakable horror to occur in this world? Now, Rowe admits that God could have some sufficiently justified reason to allow this untold suffering, but he also adds that since we are not in the position to prove one way or the other about whether God actually has such a justifiable reason, then, given our ignorance, um, there is we can assume that there is no justified reason to allow the suffering, and we can say with confidence that there probably isn't a greater good which could offset this kind of pain, and again, there probably isn't a good God who could prevent this sort of pain. Now, how to respond to Rowe? So Rowe's argument actually only works if we have independent reasons. If we don't have independent reasons to believe that God exists. But as we've seen, we have at least 5 very good reasons, and I probably have about 7 off the top of my head I could list. Although I think St. Thomas's 5 ways are the best. But we have lots of good reasons to believe that God exists, and many more, which we've covered in our course. Furthermore, we actually have reasons to believe that God not only exists, but that the God of the 5 ways that we have in our Thomist tradition, we can understand that this God is perfectly good, he's perfectly just, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, and so on and so forth. He has all these perfections of being in the uttermost sense. And so we have not an even scale, by which to weigh things either good or evil, or upon which to weigh the evidence for or against God. If we have a neutral scale and we put the problem of evil on one side, then what we have is, well, it's going to tilt in the direction of God not existing, obviously. But if we take all these other arguments that we've used in our course so far, such as Thomas's 5 ways and the arguments for God's nature, we put it on the other side, well, it balances out the scales, or, in my opinion, greatly increases the probability, if you want to call it that God exists. In fact, for St. Thomas, the problem of evil isn't one of does God exist in light of evil, but rather we know that God exists and he's good, he's omniscient and all-knowing and all-powerful. So how is it that we can account for the existence of God in the world? And while the problem of evil might be a problem for a theist, I think the atheist has a much bigger problem, which is the problem of existence. Because the problem of evil is certainly here, and it's certainly something we have to deal with. But the problem of why things exist at all is a much, much bigger problem than the problem of evil, because evil could not exist without things existing. It exists parasitically, which we'll talk about in just a little bit here. And so, given all these other factors, then Rowe's attempt to revive the problem of evil fails because we do have independent reasons to think that God not only exists, but that he's also all good, all powerful, and all knowing, etc., and so, etc., etc. And therefore, we have sufficient reasons to say that God would and does have a justifiable reason to allow for certain evils. So Rowe's argument falls flat. Now, how to respond to the second problem of evil, our second formulation here. Now, the second problem of evil, if you recall, starts by talking about how if God is the provident, knowing cause of all things, and that there is evil in the world, then God must be the cause of evil. So let's real quick clarify what evil is, yet again. So evil, and this is how we respond. So evil only subsists, let me think about this. Only subsisting beings require a direct cause. But evil is not a subsisting entity, but a privation of some due good, or a lack of due harmony. In fact, from St. Thomas's use of language, there's actually only one word for evil and one word for bad, which is the word malu. And what should strike us here is that the problem of evil for Aquinas actually isn't exactly what we would think about it. Or he doesn't think about it in the same way that we would. Because for St. Thomas, evil, something to be evil and something to be bad, it's all one big category. It's a metaphysical rather than a moral question, with moral evils being something that is a moral or natural evils, whatever that may be, something that are subsets of the greater greater genus, so to speak, of evil, which is simply the lack or privation of some sort of due good or harmony. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, think about blindness. So blindness is not a subsisting entity. It's a lack of vision. To clarify, evil is not something, nor is evil is not nothing, simply speaking. It's not just the pure absence of being, but rather it's the lack of being that should be there. Vision should be in a man's eye, but it doesn't. Need be in a rock. So rocks don't see. So the fact that a rock can't see isn't an evil for the rock. It's not a disharmony of anything in the rock, but it is a disharmony of something in the man. And so evil is a disharmony of things acting toward things in the different parts of a thing acting towards the right end, and good is the harmony of the parts acting for the right end. So, for example, a tree. A good tree is one whose roots grow down strong into the ground, leaves reach up high into the to in the canopies to take in the sun, etc., so that the whole tree can flourish. Or a good man is one who lives his life according to the right reason and therefore orders his life accordingly. And insofar as harmony is present, there is good. But insofar as it is lacking, for instance, a tree that doesn't have leaves that photosynthesize very well, there's going to be an evil. It's going to cause the tree to break down and not thrive as much as it could. Now, since evil is not a subsisting being, then God is not the direct cause of evil. And here's what I mean. So, God, we can say, is the indirect cause of evil in that he creates a material world, and that the limited and contingent nature of a material world make evil a possibility or even a reality. For example, you take the height of an oak tree. So an oak tree grows up nice and big and strong. That's great and beautiful for an oak tree, but it's not great for the sapling that lives underneath, lives in the shade of the oak tree, because the big oak tree can take in all the sun it needs, but the sapling is deprived of that same sunlight. And now, while it's the case that God is the cause of the existence and the natures of those things in a direct manner, he is not the cause of the evils, or he is not the cause of the. Let me phrase this the right way. God operates through those natures as the principal operator, and those other natures are going to be on the level of a secondary causes. And so the tree is what, and a tree in a very real sense, is what causes the sun to be blocked from the sapling. And so the evil that's done to the sapling isn't something that God's imposing upon it directly. He's not saying, I give you this evil of not getting enough light. But rather, God causes the natures of these things and the existence of these things, all of which are good things. So God only and always does a good thing. But the reality of having different material things with competing goods requires, or it follows by necessity, that sometimes they're not always going to act the right way, or they're sometimes going to bump into each other, interfere with the goods of other things, such as with respect to the interference of the goods between with other things. The tree blocks the sun from the sapling. Or the parent seeds, something goes wrong with the communication of the various reproductive processes, and then the seed that's produced doesn't communicate the right patterns into the cells, and then those cells don't photosynthesize well, and so the evil that's caused there is caused by the tree nature, which is material and subject to corruption and subject to decay and subject to change, sometimes for good, sometimes for not beneficial for treeness, and so that tree doesn't grow up the way it needs, and it's a deficient tree to some extent. And so in the same, but God still gives the nature and the existence to the tree, all of which are good things. Similarly, when it comes to the human moral acts, our kind of evil, which is moral evil, is a subset of this bigger category of metaphysical evil, which is one where we have a proper end and a proper goal in our being, but when we fail to live according to right reason, we somehow fail to fully appreciate or fully realize the goodness that God has given us and God wants us to have, and that is on our end. And the reason for that is that while God causes us to exist and causes our nature and gives us the power to act, we are the ones who truly act as somewhat independent causes of our own choices and of our own development and progress towards our goodness and our final end. So God is the cause of things insofar as they exist and insofar as they have certain natures, and he gives them the power to act, but the way in which these things act is up to the thing. and sometimes those things fail to live up to uh, the nature that God has given them, and sometimes the various goods of things in the world compete with one another, which cause some things to be deprived of the goods that they need in order to be fulfilled. And so, God is not the cause of evil, even though he knows evil exists, but he is the cause of the possibility of evil. The only cause of evil is imperfect creatures. Now, let's move on. How would a classical theist, in a more proper sense, respond to the problem of evil? So this may come as a surprise to you, but I think that the theodicy approach, where we're trying to justify God's actions or what have you, is ultimately the wrong way to address the problem of evil and the existence of God, especially from a Thomistic and classical theist point of view. So one of my favorite books I've ever read on the subject is The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil. He has a second one, which is, I think, called Thomas Aquinas and the Problem of Evil, and he draws on the work of St. Thomas and many others in the Thomistic tradition. And this book is it's a very comprehensive book. It covers quite a bit of ground, and so it gives you a very synoptic view of the theism that you'd find in St. Thomas Aquinas. So now he promotes something that actually, and by doing so, he answers the problem of evil in a more effective way than I think the theodicy approach, where we try to justify God's actions. And so his approach actually might sound odd to modern ears, especially those familiar with our contemporary apologetics. And this is because he rejects all of, or nearly all of the popular solutions to the problem of evil, which are the theodicies. Some of which include the free will defense, which especially the one by Alvin Plantinga, or the tapestry defense, or the Sunday afternoon painting defense. You have that Sunday afternoon painting where if you look up really close to it, it's a bunch of dots, but then you back up, you can actually see the whole picture. So the argument goes that we see only the small things, and sometimes we focus too much into the darkness that's in front of us. But if we backed up and could see things from God's point of view, we'd actually see that this is all a part of a grand artistic plan that God has. So we call this we can't see the whole picture argument. Or the soul-making theodicy by John Hick, where certain evils are allowed for the sake of even greater goods, particularly ones that give us a greater moral character. Or some will say that it's that evil is God's just punishment on a wicked world, or that or ones that come from open theists like Greg Boyd, who says that God suffers with us as well, so that God's not just some bystander in these evils, but he's an active participant in them. And actually, I had a debate with Greg Boyd on whether or not God could suffer, God could change, a couple of years ago, and this was right at the beginning of my master's in philosophy. And I wasn't supposed to be the one debating him. It was on a radio show I used to host, but the person who was going to debate him couldn't make it because of some work obligation that came up, and so I actually stepped up to the plate, and I think I did an okay job. Again, this guy has a PhD. He's a pastor of a megachurch around this area, around Minnesota. He's debated some pretty high profile people on these subjects before. But I still think I held my own pretty well. I'll have to find it maybe, and I'll send it to you guys. You get a view of John as an early philosopher. Anyway, so what Davies does in his book is he says, suppose that God is a moral agent like the rest of us, and suppose that he is under moral scrutiny. We have to see whether or not he's acting rightly. Would any of the defenses, that is the theodicies, be enough to exonerate God from the charge of being evil or not existing? Davies answers in the negative. Not 100% sure I agree with him there, and he provides a lot of reasons for this. But he says that this is the wrong way to go about it, one way or the other. And so he doesn't provide a theodicy of his own. Rather, he says that the whole project of theodicies is entirely wrong-headed. And so he follows St. Thomas and others in this classical theist position by arguing that God is actually not a moral agent like we are. And when we reflect on the philosophical reasons that to think that God exists, as well as what we can glean from these arguments and understand about and come to understand about God's nature through analogy and through apophatic or negative theology, we actually find that God is radically different from us. He's further apart from us than we are close to him. He's further apart from us than we are from an ant. And so he's unlike anything in our everyday experience. And so we have to watch the way that we speak about God in terms of whether or not he is uh, in the docks or on the docks, to use C.S. Lewis's term, with respect to the problem of evil. And because of these radical differences, one simply cannot offer criticisms to God and indict him or charge him with bad behavior in the way that we would critique one another. It turns out, again, on David's analysis, that traditional problem of evil is actually a non-starter. So let's revisit the problem of evil to give some context to the way that Davies approaches this, and I think it's actually a more authentic Thomistic approach than what we find in many popular writers. And so Davies begins his book by bringing up this classical problem of evil, which is which offers this like quadrilemma of issues for somebody who believes that there's an all good, all knowing, all perfect being. We've already sort of we sort of touched on this a little earlier, but he phrases it this way: Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he is malevolent. Is he both willing and able? Oh, well, then where does evil come from? Is he both? Is he neither able or willing? Then why would we? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why would we call him God? So, what is Davies' answers to this? This is clearly almost a knockdown argument. This is very powerful. It intimidates a lot of people. And so, what Davies says is that most people will draw our attention to the second question, which is he able but not willing? And therefore, he's malevolent. Davies says that most people who offer a theodicy will answer yes, but yes, God is willing to stop evil, but he's not willing. But this doesn't make him malevolent. And their aim is to show why God is morally justified in permitting certain evils, or all evil, or any evil at all. Davies, again, has no intention of following this path. So how does he do it? What is the classical theist Thomistic response? So what he does is he points out that the whole problem of evil and the way that we offer theodicies in our analysis of the problem of evil fails, and it just misses the mark. And this is because God is radically unlike us. And because of this, God simply can't be indicted by our sort of ethical analysis. So let's think about it this way. Now, if a human being, if you or I, my mom, my dad, anybody, is able to prevent a particular evil in some situation and chooses not to, then his morals should be called into question. Is he evil? Is he wicked? Is he, he doesn't have the power? Is he just a coward? Why? Why didn't he stop this evil? Now, why is this the case that we can say this sort of thing of a person who fails to stop evil, of a human person who stops to feel evil? Well, this is because a human being acting as a good human being ought to and should aim to eliminate any evil wherever possible, and to develop their own virtuous behavior. But let's consider this with respect to God. So God acting as God ought to act and ought to eliminate where possible any evil and develop some sort of virtuous behavior. Okay, there's a lot of oddities in that statement. What does it mean for God to act as God ought to? What is the further end that God has not obtained? Remember, we already argued before that God is perfectly good and perfectly possesses his goodness, so there's nothing further for him to grow in. Now, if we talk about it, if we're referring to some like Greek god, the finite Greek gods, then that makes some sense. But when applied to God of classical theism, that doesn't make any sense at all. So why is this? So first, we have no insights into what it means for the infinite God to act as he ought to, and the infinitely perfect and infinitely good God. God already possesses the fullness of being. Of course, some theists have spoken about God being bound by his nature, but this is only to say that God is bound to act as he acts and that nothing outside of him can coerce or obligate him. Meaning God acts according to his nature with respect to a metaphysical necessity rather than a moral necessity. Now, there's a broader perspective there than when we talk about metaphysical necessity versus moral necessity, because there's no moral necessity. Moral necessities require choice for some further end. But God doesn't have any further end outside of himself, because he already possesses all of the goodness within himself. And so there's nothing that could obligate God to grow in his goodness or virtue. Now, secondly, speaking of which, what about God developing virtuous behavior? So Davies argues that, again, God cannot undergo real change, because change would be either the loss or the gain of some sort of perfection. But God is perfect in himself, and he can't lose any of his perfections, because that's just metaphysically impossible. He does not move from good to better. And so the notion of him improving his behavior, it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't click with what we can know through reason alone by examining the arguments for God's existence and the conclusions that we can arrive at from those arguments. And I think one thing I want to note very quickly here is that when we talk about the way that God's knowledge works, the way that his goodness works, the way that his actions and his operations work and everything, that's kind of on the far end. And so we need to we go from the existence of God to his attributes to his operations. And we always need to move with confidence from the what's more broad to what's more specific and narrow. And so more broadly, we can say that God exists. And that's something that we can know with very strong certainty through the 5 ways. We can also know through an analysis of the conclusions of the 5 ways that God's immutable, that he's omnipotent, that he's all powerful, that he's all good, and so on and so forth. Those are all his divine attributes. Those are things that we know that with a greater confidence, with a great confidence. Then when it comes to his operations, such as how his intellect works, how his will works, how we can say that God is how God is just, those sorts of issues. Now, again, we can gather all of that from our conclusion in the 5th way, but it's several steps removed from something that's a little bit easier for us to glean, which is that God exists, and we can glean that from the existence of change in the world and so on and so forth. So when we come up to something that seems like a contradiction, like how can we say that God is just when a just person owes other people something or has duties to certain people, and God doesn't seem like he's giving all things their right good? How do we reconcile those things? Okay, well, first we have to realize we have to drop back a step. Okay, we know that God must be good, and then we start applying things to him like justice, because justice really is a perfection. It is a perfection of being. But how justice operates in God is going to be different than how justice operates in creatures. And so just because the way that we understand and think of justice operating within creatures, or moral goodness, if you want to call it that, operates in creatures, doesn't click well with the way that God is, whether it be God's knowledge or anything else, doesn't click with the way that we know God is in his immutable, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient nature, doesn't mean we've disproved any of the things that we've already established about God in earlier stages of our understanding of God, his nature, and his operations. Okay, just want to move on. So, anyway, so let's think about who this God is. We've already covered the divine attributes. So let's just touch on it again for the sake of completeness. Davies argues that God is distinct from all other things, because there's a real distinction between God as the creator and the creation. God, insofar as God is his own existence, he is the unlimited, unbounded active existence, but everything else in that exists in some limited way, by matter of fact, by nature of necessity. And we can further say that God is not like anything else in our experience, because God is a source of existence of absolutely anything and everything other than himself. God is therefore not an item in the universe. And God acts, and so we can say that when God acts in, or what he acts on, is not divine, as something external, but as the source of its existence. And God is not something the nature of which can be distinguished from the individual that he is, or in other words, God is his own nature. He's completely identical to himself. There's nothing else that he could never fit into a category of beings among other beings. This is why St. Thomas and Aristotle both say that being is not a genus, because you couldn't have something whose essence it is to exist and yet have another essence, another being whose essence is to exist, and then place them together in the same category, because there'd have to be some sort of some outer difference between them two. And so it's impossible to say that, and since all other things in the universe, all other things in existence have some sort of limitation, and by which we can place them in different categories, God, being completely without limitation, being pure being, cannot be one of the things that we list among all the things that exist, because he exists in a radically different manner, or one of the things that merely has existence in a finite way. He's not just another thing that exists in nature. And that we also know that God doesn't have a real change. At all. Maybe have some what are called Cambridge changes, but not going to get too deeply into that right now. Excuse me. But in either case, what we can say is that God is very strange. He's something that's completely different from everything else. And so why would we think that applying the same standards that we would apply to one another as rational creatures would work when we apply them to God? And so from this, it actually follows that God isn't a moral agent. There's no reason to suppose that God is a moral agent like human persons are. So, because when we usually think of moral agents, we primarily think of them as people living in the world of and capable of acting well or acting badly, and having the ability to choose between those two options, either acting well or acting badly, or being able to progress in their virtuous character. Now, it makes sense for us to have or fail to have moral reasons for doing things and refraining, because we human beings are also members of a moral community to whom we owe certain obligations. But God is not a member of any moral community or any community at all. And it's apparent, God is not, again, he's not a created thing in the universe. Rather, he's the source of everything that exists. And so God cannot improve in his behavior. What could be better than perfect goodness? Perfect subsisting goodness. He can never act badly, either. And since he's immutable, he can never change. God is always the way that he is. But what this would mean is that God is not a member of community. He can never change the way that he acts. And he doesn't have any special obligations or moral law that is above him in his own moral goodness. Now, simply put, when it comes to the problem of evil, attributing goodness or evil to God in a way that makes him a moral agent it's just a category mistake. We're thinking about the wrong things. And one major reason for this is that moral agency can't be attributed to God because the duties, obligations, habits, choices, and growth, all of which are essential to what it means to be a moral agent, cannot be said of God. A moral agent can be temperate by moderating their media intake, or courageous through swift action in the face of danger. But what would it mean for God to moderate anything with regard to his own increase in perfection? That's just nonsense. God's already completely subsisting perfection. Likewise, someone is only courageous when they do something in the face of danger, the right thing in the face of danger. But what could ever threaten God? He's outside of space and time. He's all-powerful. He's immaterial. And so if there's something that could destroy God, there's something that could subdue him in combat, or he'd never be at risk of falling to his own death or drowning. Now, concepts like courage and temperance don't make any sense when applied to God in a univocal manner. In fact, I'm not entirely sure how we could say it of God in an analogical manner, except that God always does the right thing, or that God always gives things the right measure. That is, he gives if he wants to make eagles, he's going to give them an essence which allows them to fly. All right, that's about it. And it's because of this, when we approach the problem of evil as if God had something to answer for, then we're framing the question in a way which does not reflect the reality of who God is and our relationship to him. Sometimes I like to think about this. This is a kind of a gross metaphor here, but you'll understand what I'm saying, I think. So sailors on a ship might have a duty to one another, and even the captain of the ship might have a duty to the whole crew. But the captain of the ship is somebody who is a part of the crew, part of the ship. For those of you who like the Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, they have a duty to each other to act rightly and to do whatever it takes to make sure that the vessel has a good voyage. But the sea, however, owes them nothing and is not a moral agent whatsoever. nor is the sea a member of the crew. Now, for very different reasons, and so the crew, when they speak of the sea being wicked today, or evil, or shaking their fist at the sea and saying, "Why, if you're a good ocean, would you toss up the waves onto the deck?" It doesn't make any sense. It's a silly, it's just a way of speaking metaphorically or poetically. And so, for very different reasons, again, God is not a member of the community of beings, nor is he any member of a community to whom he has any obligations to act in a certain way whatsoever. So when we raise the problem of evil in light of the God of classical theism, what we're doing is we're simply saying, if God is all good, then he has to answer for all these evils in the world. Then we're doing nothing than making a category mistake on the level or similar to the blaming the ocean, morally speaking, for why all the gunpowder got wet. If the sea really is a good place to be, then why would we have wet gunpowder? I mean, this doesn't even make any sense. You're not going to put the ocean on trial, and in a way, it's like saying, why? Well, how can we put God on trial? Why do we have to justify what God does? For a Thomist, the question or the problem of evil isn't whether the existence of evil disproves the existence of God, but rather the question is, given that there is a good God who is all-powerful and all-knowing, why is there evil? These are two realities which appear to be contrary at first, but as we've seen, there is a number of reasonable attempts by which we can make at least some sense of the existence of evil in the world. And so we're not trying to say that evil doesn't disprove God, because we know for other very good reasons that God does exist. But we can also say that evil cannot disprove the existence of God, almost in principle, especially if we consider it in light of classical theism. But what we have to ask is, why is it that a good God would allow for certain evils to exist in the world? And again, we have plenty of reasons to do so. And I think that is where the theodicies come in. But why God would allow certain evils so that we can become courageous or compassionate or merciful, or that he might have some greater good in mind, which comes about only through allowing certain evils. But the problem of evil in itself is dead on arrival.